I had an interesting conversation with a coworker last week, and I thought it might be worth making a video about it. To set up the background on this, I'm a software developer. I have a bachelor's and a master's degree in applied computer science. And as you can probably guess, in my field of study and line of work, I've run into a lot of people who don't necessarily share the same views I do when it comes to faith, God, and Christianity. And I usually go out to eat for lunch with a group of guys who all happened to be on a business trip last week, so I couldn't go out to eat with them, obviously. But another coworker of mine came by around 12:30, and he asked if I wanted to go out and grab a bite to eat. So I said sure. This is a guy who I'm an acquaintance with. I've known him for a few years, although we've never really been close friends. We actually went to the same university together. But even though we were in the same department, I was a grad student at the time, he was an undergrad, so we weren't in the same program, didn't share the same classes. Anyway, he was hired at my company at the end of last year, and we're just now starting to work on the same projects together, so we're starting to interact more, and he asked if I wanted to go out to eat, so I said sure, and we went to a nearby Subway. While we were there, just making conversation, he started talking about politics. And he's a Republican who, in this last election, decided to vote for Barack Obama, which I thought was a little strange, and we were talking more. And it turns out that he has become completely disenchanted with the Republican Party because, in his view, he sees an undue influence of Christians in the party. And then he went on to say how he was pleasantly surprised by Barack Obama making mention of non-believers in his inaugural address. So you can see where this is going. He was making it clear that he's an atheist. And I actually was already aware of that because I had seen his Facebook page. But I took the opportunity to kind of, ask a little more and probe a little deeper how he became an atheist and what his background was, how he was raised and the like. And it turns out he was raised in a Christian home, and in fact he himself was a Christian. He took it quite seriously. He wasn't just a nominal Christian, but was a devout practitioner of his faith through high school. And so I asked, well, what was it that caused you to turn? Did you have a bad experience, or, what was it that caused you to make the transition? And he said no, he had a great life in the church, and, everything was great. He was in a Christian band, and a lot of supportive friends, and all the rest of it. But when he went off to college, he began to learn more about science, and particularly about evolution, and about theories of how the universe could have come to be. And in his words, he began to see less and less need for a God. That's what he said. And that when looking at the world around us, he saw two competing hypotheses, God and naturalism. And using Occam's razor, he said naturalism makes more sense. That even though we don't have all the answers right now, it made more sense for him to believe that everything in the universe could have come to be through naturalistic processes rather than to hypothesize a God, a deity. And those of you who know what Occam's razor is, you'll know that it's a principle in science that when you have two competing hypotheses to explain some phenomena, you take the simpler of the two explanations. And it's a good principle. It does work in science to help you arrive at the best hypothesis that you can. Start from simpler and disprove, falsify, and only go more complex as need be. But the flaw in this is he's trying to evaluate the Christian God only as if it is put forward as a hypothesis to explain how the world came to be and how life on earth developed. And you really can't see Christianity or the Christian God as just a hypothesis to explain these things. The Christian God is a God who claims to have had his hand in history, and not just to have had his hand in history, but to have himself entered history in the person of Jesus. He split time in two. We reckon time based on when he came to this earth in the West, BC and AD. But I told him that I had gone through a similar crisis of faith in high school, because I went through a lot of the same things that he described. And keep in mind, we're both coming from the same background. We're both computer scientists who are trained to think logically. But I tried to point out to him, you have to evaluate Christianity not just in that arena, but look at it through the lens of history, and evaluate its claims by looking through the lens of history. A good analogy would be if one person makes the claim that a figure named George Washington played an integral part in leading the Continental Army to defeat the British and to secure the independence of the American colonies and set up a system in which they could be autonomous from Britain and come together as the United States. And someone makes that claim, and then another person comes along and says, well, I can foresee how the United States could acquire its independence without the need for a George Washington. I don't see the need for the George Washington figure in all this. I can foresee how these things could happen through other means, so therefore I don't see a need to hypothesize a George Washington. And then you say, well, let's go look at some of the historical documents written by the people who were actually there at the time, and let's see what they have to say about it. And they say, well, I really don't see the need to propose this George Washington figure when there are simpler ways to come to an autonomous American nation. And I think that sounds absurd, obviously, to anyone who hears that. So, of course, if we want to evaluate the claim about George Washington, we have to go back and look at what was written by the people who were there at the time, and also look to see what has been believed about the subject since then. In the same way, if we want to evaluate the claims about Christ and about the Christian God, we have to go back to the primary sources and see what did the people who were there at the time have to say about it, and also what has been believed about this subject in our history since then. It's never helpful to pretend like we're starting at square one, that we don't have a history to look to and we're starting fresh. We look back to the Gospels, the epistles, those things preserved in the New Testament, and I know that skeptics will say that they would prefer to see an extra biblical work that can speak to these issues. But I think the answer to this is pretty obvious. When you understand that the Bible is not one book written by a single author from Genesis to Revelation, but is instead a collection of books and letters, and when you understand how the New Testament was canonized, that question, or that request for an extra biblical work that speaks to these issues, it doesn't make sense for this reason. The New Testament and the books that are in it are there specifically because they meet certain criteria. They were written by an apostle or someone who was close to an apostle. They were written in the first century. They speak to the events in question. So all of the books available at that time, all of the letters available at that time that meet these criteria were included in the New Testament because they met that criteria. So to say, can we see an extra biblical work, a book not included in the Bible, that speaks to these issues, that meets those criteria, it's to misunderstand how the New Testament was canonized, because all of the works available at that time that met that criteria were included in the New Testament for that reason. So I think it's important to understand that. But as I told my friend, we have to look to what was written by the people who were around at the time.